Hi, and welcome to another in my series of videos on one of the most important documents from early Christianity, the Gospel of John. This time, we're going to be looking at the structure of John and how understanding that structure can deepen our understanding of all of the individual stories within the book. We can try to make sense of John's Gospel as a whole from a few different angles. We can look at the theological story that lies behind his narrative. We can collect the images and motifs that John comes back to over and over. If we think of the fourth gospel like a piece of music, this is like the key that John plays in. We can ask which notes he chooses to use over and over as he builds his melody. But staying with that music metaphor, we can also follow the overarching structure of the melody. Is it divided into verses with a chorus? How do those verses relate? Do they build towards a bridge section near the end? Does the final chorus raise the intensity? Does the song suddenly end on a high note or bring us down after a final chorus to a closing resolution? What, in other words, is the overarching linear structure of John's Gospel? It's fairly common to see outlines of biblical books that divide them into sections with their own section titles. Outlines like this can seem a bit mysterious. How do scholars know how to divide up the sections? Where do they get the headings from? This can be even more confusing when we compare a few commentaries and realize that scholars don't agree about the outline. They might put the section boundaries in different places sometimes, and they definitely have different titles attached to the sections. So is this kind of structural outline just made up? Is it totally subjective? Well, when it's done well, a structural analysis of a book comes down to recognizing patterns. Usually, we recognize a section in a book by looking for points where a pattern in the book's contents is consistent for a while and then changes to a new pattern that remains consistent in its new shape. Exactly what kind of patterns are we talking about? Well, it can really be any dimension of the text. Often we're talking about changes in the theme or topic. In John's Gospel, early on, we notice that everything is focused on the question of Jesus' identity. Will people recognize and believe who he really is? The stories revolve around people seeing evidence of who Jesus is and then being confronted with the question of what to do with that evidence. Will they decide to become disciples and follow Jesus? Will those who are already disciples continue to follow and move into deeper understanding of his identity, even when things get difficult or confusing? Little to nothing is said here about ethics, about how disciples should live. This focus remains consistent from chapter 1 all the way through to the end of chapter 12. At that point, though, we notice the focus change. Suddenly, we're not focused any longer on Jesus' identity and people's need to decide. Now we're focused on the impending departure of Jesus and preparing the disciples to continue in his absence. No one in these scenes is coming to new faith any longer, but Jesus begins talking intensively about how they should live, about ethics, and he begins warning them that he's about to leave, offering them comfort ahead of time. All this suggests that there's a structural shift at the end of chapter 12. So we might divide the whole book into two halves. Chapters 1 to 12 about Jesus' identity and coming to faith, and chapters 13 to 21 about Jesus' departure and the lifestyle that goes along with faith. But we might then notice another shift in focus after chapter 17, because there, Jesus' effort to prepare the disciples for his departure ends, and the actual departure itself begins. Jesus' arrest in the garden, his trials, his crucifixion, and finally his resurrection from the dead. There are other motifs, too, that are repeated through chapters 1 to 12, but don't appear after that point. One is the repeated mention of signs. 6 times, Jesus performs an act of power, and John calls it specifically a sign. But all 6 come in chapters 1 to 12. The first is the turning of water into wine in chapter 2, and the last is the raising of Lazarus in chapter 11. So it's not even just that these signs happen to only appear within these chapters. They also seem more or less evenly spread across the chapters of this section. If we think about it for a moment, we might then realize that these signs are connected to the theme in chapters 1 to 12 of Jesus' identity and people's decision about him. For in each case, the sign seems precisely to serve as an outstanding signal pointing toward Jesus' true identity and demanding that those who witness it make a choice. But a good analysis of a book's structure won't focus just on one dimension of the text like this. We'll look at different aspects of the text and try to find the points where patterns change on several different levels at the same time. In a narrative, one thing we can pay attention to is the cast of characters. Jesus remains at the center of the story from beginning to end in John, but who else appears around him? From chapter 1 to chapter 12, we find a rotating cast of characters. Nathanael, Peter, Jesus' mother, Nicodemus, the Samaritan woman, the man born blind, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, etc. Many scenes also include a broad group character like crowds, the Jews, or scribes and Pharisees. We notice a sudden shift, though, at the end of chapter 12, once again. From the beginning of chapter 13 through to chapter 18, the only characters around Jesus are the closest disciples. It's a small group, few enough to share a meal together, and the group remains consistent rather than changing. That reinforces the sense of an important transition after chapter 12, verse 50. Other characters enter the scene again in chapters 18 to 19. Some temple guards, the high priest, Pilate, and then for chapters 20 to 21, we revert to just the disciples. So, once again, we find the major transition at the end of chapter 12, with possibly another transition coming between chapters 17 and 18. And maybe another transition that we might not have noticed before between chapters 19 and 20, between the crucifixion of Jesus and the resurrection scenes. So far, we've looked at theme and at characters. What about setting? We don't have a consistent setting through the early chapters of John's Gospel. The scenes move back and forth between Galilee and Judea, the remote countryside, small villages, and Jerusalem itself. But, once again, this shifts dramatically at the end of chapter 12. All of chapters 13 to 17 take place in one room during one evening, the night before Jesus' death. This static setting becomes dynamic again in chapter 18, as the scene moves to Gethsemane, then the high priest's house, Pilate's administrative headquarters, the Praetorium, all in the space of one chapter. So once again, the main transition points seem to come at the ends of chapters 12 and 17. We might also notice, too, a shift in setting between chapters 20 and 21. The events of Jesus' passion and resurrection all take place in and around Jerusalem until chapter 21, where we find ourselves abruptly shuttled back to Galilee by the Sea of Tiberias. This may not be too significant, but it could also hint at a transition point at the beginning of chapter 21. Finally, the same structure is reinforced when we look at narrative pacing. This is how much time is covered by a given number of words in the text. A sentence can speed up the narrative time using a few words to relate days or even weeks of events. Or narrative time can slow to almost real-world time, as when a speaker gives an extended speech. Narrative time varies its pace through chapters 1 to 12, but nowhere does a chapter cover less than a full day. We might slow to nearly real-world time at key points in each episode, but the narrative soon speeds up again to cover days or weeks with short summary statements. So it's a shock when Jesus' evening of conversation with the disciples continues not just through all of chapter 13, but on through to the end of 17. 5 full chapters are spent moving slowly over a handful of hours shared by Jesus and his disciples. Then narrative time speeds up again from chapter 18 to the book's end. Mark has sometimes been called a passion narrative with an extended introduction. John, by contrast, seems more like an account of Jesus' final night framed by extended introduction and epilogue, the crucifixion and resurrection themselves are dwarfed in size by this intimate, near real-time account of Jesus' farewell discourse. Narrative pacing is a big part, too, of what sets the prologue in 1:1 to 18 apart from the rest of chapters 1 to 12, even apart from the rest of the book. If the farewell scene of chapters 14 to 17 stands out for how the narrative time slows, the first part of chapter 1 is even more startling for its sheer speed. The whole span of millennia, from creation to Jesus' human birth, is covered in a few short verses. That means that the scale of events, too, is entirely different from the scale of events in the book's other sections. Everything happens at the level of the entire cosmos. Likewise, the characters that appear in the prologue are drawn on a totally different scale than the one used elsewhere in John. God and the Word are individuals who stand astride the cosmos by their nature. The other actors, though, are collective characters on this same cosmic level. The darkness seems to represent all of humanity, possibly all of creation in its current state. When the Word enters creation, his own respond collectively, again representing at least the majority of the human species. Those who receive the Word's light, who believe in him, represent a smaller subset of humanity, but those many thousands are still treated together as one collective. The only character who appears at an ordinary human scale is John the Baptist, and even he appears because of his singular role in cosmic scale events, as the herald of the Word's arrival. So by looking at several different aspects of the narrative, and watching for relatively stable patterns that shift at a certain point, we can recognize basic transition points in John's story, places where there are shifts in pattern on several different levels. The more dimensions of the text we find shifting at the same point in the story, the more likely it is that we really have found a structural transition point that was built in by the author. But we can also look for more formal transition markers. I don't mean formal in the sense of dressing up in a tux. Most genres and modes of discourse have more or less standardized conventions for marking the beginnings and endings of stages in a text. One of these is the closing summary and purpose statement. Sometimes we find that these reinforce the structural analysis that we arrived at by following the shifts in the narrative's patterns. We find one such formal transition at the end of chapter 12, not surprisingly. In 12:37, we find a summary of the people's overall response to the signs Jesus has presented to them throughout his career. Although he had performed so many signs in their presence, they did not believe in him. And the summary continues after a slight pause in verses 42 and 43. Nevertheless, many, even of the authorities, believed in him, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue, for they loved human glory more than the glory that comes from God. So we have a summary here of the predominant response to Jesus at the apex of his human career. Despite all of these signs, most refuse to believe, and even those who do respond with faith fall short of the call to act as witnesses, to confess it publicly. Is this really all Jesus' signs have accomplished in chapters 1 through 12? In between these two sections of summary, the evangelist explains how this isn't a failure, but is still part of God's plan. This was to fulfill the word spoken by the prophet Isaiah, "Lord, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" And so they could not believe, because Isaiah also said, "He has blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, so that they might not look with their eyes and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them." Isaiah said this because he saw his glory and spoke about him. Now, we'll have to talk later about exactly what John's saying here about the purpose of Jesus' signs. For the moment, though, the point is that at the end of chapter 12, John pauses first to sum up the response to Jesus' signs as a whole, and also to relate that result to God's plan. If this weren't clear enough as a marker that we've reached a turning point, John then spends the few remaining verses of chapter 12 providing a dense restatement of Jesus' core teaching. This is especially striking since in verse 36, just before, we've already been told that Jesus has withdrawn from public. His career of open teaching is over. This means that when Jesus' voice is heard in verses 44 to 50, the words stand outside any situation in the narrative, outside the sequence of narrative events. Then Jesus cried aloud, "Whoever believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me. And whoever sees me sees him who sent me. I have come as light into the world, so that everyone who believes in me should not remain in the darkness. I do not judge anyone who hears my words and does not keep them, for I came not to judge the world, but to save the world. The one who rejects me and does not receive my word has a judge. On the last day, the word that I have spoken will serve as a judge. For I have not spoken on my own, but the Father who sent me has himself given me a commandment about what to say and what to speak. And I know that his commandment is eternal life. What I speak, therefore, I speak just as the Father has told me." This is why Johannine scholars agree universally that the boundary between chapters 12 and 13 marks the basic watershed, the fundamental turning point in John's Gospel. Not only do so many patterns in theme and narrative shift together at this point, but at that same moment, John gives a formal summary both of Jesus' teaching and of the human response to it. Hence the overwhelming agreement that 1:19 through to 12:50 constitute one major section in John that might appropriately be called the Book of Signs. Following that boundary comes the very different farewell scene that encompasses both Jesus' washing of his disciples' feet and the long speeches of the farewell discourse. Finally, after the narrative shifts at the end of chapter 17, we arrive at Jesus' passion and resurrection. And since throughout the gospel this has been described as the moment of Jesus' glory, some such label is often given to that climactic section. It is the revelation of Jesus' glory. So very often, formal transitions coincide with turning points that are already marked out by other dimensions of the text. But sometimes, formal transitions help to mark turning points that would otherwise be less obvious. Chapters 20 to 21 both relate appearances of the risen Jesus to the disciples, so we might naturally lump them together as a single section. But a closing summary interrupts this continuity in 20 verses 30 to 31. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. Like at the end of chapter 12, here John sums up the purpose of the narrative that came before. This time, though, the summary seems to cover all of the previous sections. The reference to signs and to the book signal that this is a closing summary to the whole narrative. This is, of course, why most think chapter 21 was likely added by the editors of John's final edition. But it also means that we need to add one last basic boundary line between chapters 20 and 21. Chapter 21 stands on its own as a kind of epilogue to John's book, mirroring, in a sense, the prologue of 1 to 18. We'll have to consider later on why those editors decided that an epilogue should focus on these particular episodes revolving around Peter and his position in the early Christian movement. But all of this leaves us with an overall division of John into three main sections with an additional prologue and epilogue. What debate there is around this top-level structure has to do primarily with how strong the boundary is between chapter 17 and chapter 18. Is the farewell scene in 13 to 17 its own independent section of the narrative? Or is all of chapters 13 to 20 a unified section of the book? Raymond Brown labeled 13 to 20 the Book of Glory, the structural counterpart to the Book of Signs in chapters 1 to 12. Many scholars point out, though, that a lot of aspects of the narrative shift together at the end of 17, just as they did at the end of 12. Once again, we find changes in theme, characters, setting, and narrative pacing. The Book of Signs has a clear overarching unity focused on Jesus presenting humanity with himself and with the evidence for his identity. All of the episodes in that earlier section revolve around the same question of whose testimony to trust, of whether to believe. But it's far less clear that there's a similar unity holding 13 to 17 together with 18 to 20. So I'll tend to treat 13 to 17 as its own section, the farewell scene, focused on Jesus' preparation of those disciples who have responded well to the signs. And 18 to 20 is, I think, its own section that is related to both the Book of Signs and the farewell scene. It's in chapters 18 to 20 that we see Jesus go to the cross, rise again, and give the Holy Spirit to his followers. This is, in the end, the ultimate demonstration that Jesus is who he had claimed through the Book of Signs. At the same time, this is where we see the departure that Jesus had warned about through the farewell scene. And this is where we see Jesus make good on his promise not to leave the disciples alone, but to return and remain with them through the mediation of God's Spirit. But whether our outline of the book treats 13 to 20 as a section with two parts, or whether it treats the farewell and the Passion Resurrection as top-level sections, is less important than the basic three-step structure we've found in John. The book as a whole moves from Jesus giving signs, to giving comfort, to finally demonstrating his truthfulness and reliability in both of those first two stages. The audience is first invited to embrace Jesus in faith, then asked to trust their master through bitter disappointment, and finally offered the joy of seeing their trust vindicated. This three-stage structure is clear regardless of how we draw the outline. So why does all of this matter? Because when John tells a story or writes a speech, he assumes we are noticing where it comes in this sequence. If an episode comes in the Book of Signs, that context tells us to expect that it will present us with testimony about Jesus' identity. Such an episode will present us with examples of good and bad responses, of faith and unfaith. And so those episodes will invite the audience to reaffirm their faith and reject unbelief. If a story or speech comes in the farewell scene, though, that tells us to expect something different. Knowing that context, we should be looking for how Jesus is preparing the disciples for his absence, for life as a community without his immediate bodily presence. We should be looking for the element of comfort and reassurance, along with the ethical implications. On the other hand, the lack of structural boundary between chapters 19 and 20 suggests that when we come to the cross, we should understand it and the resurrection as two parts of one decisive event. Granted, we did notice earlier a shift in the cast of characters at the end of 19, returning in chapter 20 to just focus on Jesus and his inner circle. But that was really the only pattern that changed at this point. We don't find multiple dimensions of the text shifting pattern the way we would expect if it were a major turning point. And the sequence of events lead in quick succession directly from the death of Jesus in 19 to the discovery of the tomb empty on the following morning. So the whole sequence of Jesus' arrest, trial, crucifixion, and resurrection seem to be presented as one complex of events. This is not, for John, a defeat followed by vindication. It is all one climactic, glorious moment of the light's victory over darkness. This fits, after all, with John's emphasis that Jesus doesn't suffer on the cross as a victim, but goes deliberately to the cross because it is the plan. The cross is the doorway opening onto the resurrection that follows. It's all, then, the moment in which the divine glory is revealed in Jesus. Finally, the position of chapter 21 as epilogue calls us to consider how those stories about Peter help the audience to receive John's Gospel as a whole in the right perspective. I hope you can see here why the overarching structure of John's book matters, not as an end in itself or just as an academic exercise, but because it helps us to understand the focus and the purpose of each episode along the way. Thanks for watching. I'm Ian Scott, and I'm Associate Professor of New Testament at Tyndale Seminary in Toronto, Canada. If you enjoyed this video, take a moment to click the like button and think about subscribing to my channel.